it's fair to say the Hypercrypt Legion is all about scoring, and to be fair, that really suits my playstyle. Today I'm going to share my take on a Hypercrypt Legion 2000 point Necron list. And yes, no monolith. It's coming right up.
Necrons!
Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, continuing my little mini-series of making lists with the new Necron detachments from the 10th edition Codex, and today we're looking at the Hyperphase Legion. No, we're not. We're looking at the Hypercrypt Legion. Now, I've had a list ready for a few weeks now. However, I've been waiting for the data slate and points changes to happen before, well, I made this video. However, there were no point changes for Necrons, and we had no real data slate rule change for Necrons either. Of course, some of the cool rules changed and affect us a little bit, but on the whole, we were pretty unscathed by the changes. So I'm now in a position to share my Hypercrypt Legion list. Now, it's fair to say, unlike my last list building video with the Abacience Phalanx detachment, which was one of our weakest detachments, the Hypercrypt Legion detachment is one of our strongest one, if not the strongest one. And of course, we had Necrons winning LVO, the Las Vegas Open, recently with a Hypercrypt Legion list, and it was quite interesting to see the list that won. And actually, it's been very interesting seeing people's Hypercrypt Legion list. However, today I'm going to share my take on a list. Now, of course, me being me is going to be a little bit different to maybe what others are using, although obviously some elements are going to be the same. But I always like to put my twist on a list. I'm going to try to make a list which is going to do as well as I can on the table, and I'm going to share my thought process of how I built the list in hope that it helps you with your list building. So, where to start? And I'm going to start straight off talking about the monolith, which, of course, in the Hypercrypt Legion is pretty good. There are 4 out of 6 stratagems designed basically for the monolith. I think they want you to play a monolith in this detachment. And not only that, obviously it's got some very cool rules. However, there's a few reasons why I've not played the monolith in my list. Now, I'll be honest, I started my list with a monolith in it, as I tend to do when I'm list building. Is I populate my list building app with the units I think I want to play, and then I adjust and adapt and sort of reduce the quantities, because there's usually more than I can actually afford in terms of points. And the monolith was there. I added units which I thought would be very useful if I played the monolith, in particular Imitek the Stormlord, to give me that extra CP, because a lot of the stratagems are 2 CPs, and I'm going to be using quite a few stratagems if I'm playing the monolith. However, the monolith is fairly costly in points, and when I started to add the units which I wanted to use in conjunction with the monolith, the more I built this list around the monolith, the more I thought, this isn't the list that I want to play. Certainly for my first list with the Hypercrypt Legion. So in the end, I actually dropped the monolith. Without the monolith in the list, I didn't have to think about all the trickery that I would have to do with the monolith there. I wouldn't have to think about which stratagems I'm going to use. There's only going to be 2 stratagems which I can use, well, the Necron stratagems anyway. So it's going to be a bit easier to play, which is always handy when you're playing a brand new list, especially if you're, well, short for time when you're playing. I mean, when I'm playing a game and I'm recording the video, I only have a certain amount of time to do that. So I thought it would be easier from a battle report type of view as well, just to make things a little bit more simpler. So I decided to drop the monolith, and that meant I felt I didn't really need Imitek the Stormlord in the list, because, well, like I said, I'm limited on CPs, and the CPs which I have are only 1 CP anyway. So Imitek and the monolith were out, and I started to look at what I would want to put in. Now, before we move on to units and the list itself, I want to quickly run over the Hypercrypt Legion special rule, which I'm sure you know about, but just in case you don't. So at the end of your opponent's turn, you can select a number of Necrons units from your army, excluding units that are within engagement range of one or more enemy units. The maximum number of units you can select depends on the battle size as follow: Incursion 2 units, Strike Force 3 units, Onslaught 4 units. Once you've made your selections, remove those units from the battlefield and place them into Strategic Reserve. So we can basically remove 3 units and then redeploy them again in our turn. Pretty cool. Now I got thinking about this and my list started to develop. So first of all, let's talk about Catans. So my initial list had a Deceiver in it because I thought the Deceiver's ability to redeploy would work quite well with the theme of the Hypercrypt Legion. However, the Deceiver is probably the weakest of all of the Catans that we have, so he didn't make it into my list. As I said, I originally had the Monolith and Imatech, those were gone. I originally had some Wraiths with a Technomancer, wanted to try out the Wraith unit teleporting around. However, in the end I did drop that unit because I wanted more shooty units. The list I felt needed units that could shoot more than assault, so I dropped those. I also had some flayed ones in the list as well, just some upfront infiltrating support. At the time you couldn't redeploy flayed ones, and of course with the rules changes now you can. However, I decided not to add the flayed ones into the list. I dropped them originally and I'm keeping them dropped. So those were some of the thoughts that I had about units I wanted in the list that didn't make it into the list. However, the units which did make it into the list, the first 2 units were the Nightbringer and the Void Dragon. Both of those Catans are solid choices. They can do a reasonable amount of work on the table and they're suited very well to the Hypercrypt Legion, so I think that was a good starting point. Now, one thing which I knew I didn't want to do in this list is have lots of big units of Immortals flying around the table because I wanted to try something different. However, I wanted Immortals in the list, and in the end I went for 2 units of 5 Immortals. These were going to be my home objective taking units. I've gone for 2 units of 5 rather than 1 unit of 10, just in case I find myself in a position where it would be handy to have another unit to teleport, so I can still teleport 1 unit and then have the other one on the backfield objective. So that was the idea, 2 units on my backfield objective. I have options to remove 1 or maybe sort of just walk away from the objective at the back if I need to, etc. So now I had to think about some deep striking units because of course if you have the deep strike special rule then you can come down anywhere on the table. If you don't, then you're limited to the normal reserves rules where you have to sort of basically walk in on the table edges. So deep strike units is what I was looking at, and as I've just painted my death marks, I was thinking 2 units of 10 death marks. Now I usually take 2 units of 5 death marks and they're there just for secondaries. I just put them into reserve and they come down and they can do behind enemy lines, etc. So it's going to be slightly different now. I've got 2 units of 10 deep strike ability. These units can be taken off of the table in my opponent's turn and then I can bring them down. Of course, we've got a stratagem which lets us get very close when we do deploy, which I'll talk more about stratagems later in the video. So we could potentially steal objectives with this unit. We have a reasonable amount of shooting. 2 units have the reasonable amount of sniper ability if I do need to snipe out characters. And once they come down, they're going to require a reasonable amount of work to remove them from play before I obviously can jump back up again. So I thought it was a good choice, and it means I'm playing my recently painted miniatures, which is always fun. However, without the small unit of death marks there, and even though I can teleport units around, I felt I needed some units with a very small footprint to get into those small places on the table. And the ideal unit for that is the Hexmark Destroyer, lone operative single miniature that already has the deep strike ability, and I'm going to take 2 Hexmark Destroyers. They will probably just go into standard reserve and come in on turn 2, not taking up how many units I can take off the table turn 1. So 2 Hexmark Destroyers in the list. One of them, I put an enhancement on it. The Dimensional Overseer, +1 to hyperphase number. So in my 2000 point list, I'll be able to hyperphase 4 units. Now that may be a bit overkill. I may not use it, but for the small amount of points that it costs for this enhancement, I think it's worth having. Having the knowledge that you can hyperphase up to 4 units, I think, could be quite useful, especially in those last play moves where you're trying to get as many points as you can. So 1 Hexmark Destroyer with that enhancement, and the other one at the moment, because it does change in a bit, but at the moment doesn't have an enhancement. Okay, so now I start thinking about having some heavy guns in the list, because it's always good to have some big guns, either Doomstalkers, Doomsday Arcs or Locust Heavy Destroyers. Obviously there are other options. I don't have the monolith in the list, so I haven't got that option. Now Canoptic Doomstalkers of course are generally better in the Canoptic Court. I've recently played Doomsday Arcs, so it's Heavy Destroyers as my choice. 2 units of Heavy Destroyers with the Gauss Destructors. And 1 unit of Heavy Destroyers with the Enitic Exterminator. The Exterminator guns. And the reason that I've taken this is because, well, these basically took place of my Wraith. So I originally had the Wraiths in there and I went for this unit instead. And I'm going to have a Locust Lord with this unit. Sounds like a fun unit to jump around the table. Now of course there is an enhancement to give the unit deep strike, which is what I was going to do with the Wraiths. However, I haven't done that for this particular unit. So the enhancement I've taken on the Locust Lord is the Arisen Tyrant, which gives me the ability to reroll ones to hit, and also the turn that I'm set up I can reroll all hits, which I think is going to be a great ability on a Heavy Destroyer unit with this gun. Now of course it does mean that I'm going to not be able to come anywhere on the table, and I'm going to be restricted to those board edges. However, I don't think that will be a problem. The table's pretty small. I'm going to be able to get almost where I want to be. And remember, this unit isn't necessarily about taking objectives, although of course it could be quite handy if I've got engage in all fronts, for example. However, it's going to be there mainly to use its guns and cause a distraction as my Catans advance forward, move forward, potentially deep strike on the board edges, all the options that are available in this detachment. Okay, so next up it's my faithful 2 units of 3 Scarab Swarms. Now arguably in this particular detachment where we can move around so much, you don't necessarily need these 2 units, because I'm going to be using these in my deployment zone. They're going to be in the corners of my deployment zone. They're going to be there for the secondary investigate signals. Now they also double up as board control units in my deployment zone to help stop any deep strikers coming in. So they have 2 reasons for being in the list. As I said, I don't necessarily need them. I could just jump a unit into the corners if I needed to. But I think I'd rather have my jumping units going forward and doing damage that way and doing their objectives that way, and then have my investigate signals in my deployment zone covered with the 2 Scarab units. They're pretty cheap in points for the amount of wounds that they have. So 2 Scarab units are in the list. So the list was starting to come along quite nicely. I had a closer look at it and how I was going to use the list and maybe looked for some gaps. Now originally I had some flayed ones in the list. They were going to infiltrate to give me early first turn objective grabbing, maybe for some secondaries where I have to take the centre of the board, for example. And without the flayed ones in the list, I felt that's where the list was lacking. So, in steps the Transcendent Catan. Yes, a third Catan. However, I think he's very well suited to this army. He's a nice fast moving unit. He can jump around. A part of the Hypercrypt Legion abilities obviously is to jump around, and he suits this very well, and of course he's not limited to the board edge. So I think it's an ideal solution for what I was looking for. That left me with a few points left over, and I didn't really have much to put it on. So I took a second enhancement on my other Hexmark Destroyer. I took the transfer node, which gives the Hexmark Destroyer an auto advance of 6 inches, which potentially could be quite useful if I want to move somewhere quite quickly. So that's my entire list, but what about the stratagems and how am I going to use them? So as I said, 4 of the 6 stratagems in this detachment are for monoliths, but the other 2 aren't, and they're only 1 CP each, so pretty usable. We've got Reanimation Crit, which effectively lets you reanimate a unit that's in reserve, so you put it off the table. Let's say I pull some death marks off the table and there's only 3 death marks left. I can then use this for 1 CP and do my reanimation protocol still, which is pretty useful. We then have Cosmic Precision. This lets a unit come down within 3 inches of your enemy, which is going to be really useful. Basically it lets you deep strike really close. Very useful if I want to try to steal an objective from someone, maybe sort of dump a load of death marks on a unit and be more OC scoring than my opponent. So I could take objectives. I think it could be quite useful, but more importantly, when I'm playing this list, I'm not going to be thinking too much about stratagems, or which stratagems I'm going to use and how I'm going to use them, which I think if I'd taken the monolith I would have been in that position. So it's going to be nice and easy to play, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun to play. But how am I going to play it? So starting on my home objective, I've got the 2 units of Immortals. They're going to pretty much stay there all of the game. I could move one away if I need to, so that I've still got 1 on the objective. I could potentially hypercrypt it if I needed to. Next to them will be the 2 units of Locust Heavy Destroyers with the Gauss Destructor, just backing them up. And then of course we've got the Scarabs in my corners. I've got my 3rd unit of Locust Heavy Destroyers with the Locust Lords, and this unit is designed in the list to be teleporting around. Of course I'm going to put my 2 Hexmark Destroyers in tactical reserve so they can come in and again do secondary objectives. The death marks will deploy and again teleport around as and when, depending on the objective cards that I get. The Nightbringer and the Void Dragon are going to push forward and just cause a big distraction and have the option to teleport with the Hyperphase Crypt as well. And of course the Transcendent Catan can teleport anyway each turn. So we've got a lot of movement there. As I said, I've got the ability to teleport 4 units if needed. I'm thinking maybe 2 units of death marks, 1 unit of Locust Destroyers, and potentially a Nightbringer. I've got the options to really teleport some units around if I need to, and that gives me lots of options to hopefully score lots of points. It's fair to say the Hypercrypt Legion is all about scoring, and to be fair, that really suits my playstyle quite a lot. However, I think this list has some good ability to destroy units as well, so I'm really looking forward to playing it. I'm going to be playing it against Richard and his Orcs, but I'm also going to be playing it against Rory from Shed Gaming and his Tyranids. Both of those battle reports will come to the channel very soon, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss them. In the meantime, here is my battle reports playlist, and here is my list building video on the Obsidian, and here is my previous list building video for you to watch next.